Hello, my name is Zach Shields, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute of Politics Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you all for attending tonight's program. The Dole Institute Student Advisory Board is composed of KU students committed to the work of the Dole Institute. We attend regular meetings, assist in events like this one, and plan an SAB-sponsored program every semester. Members of the SAB receive great opportunities to network with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact the Dole Institute. The Dole Institute would like to hear from you. If you enjoy tonight's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website email. Your attendance and feedback help us shape future programming. Before we begin tonight, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for audience questions and answers. If you have a question, please raise your hand. A student helper with a microphone will come to you, and please ask just one brief question. And now please welcome Barbara Ballard, the Associate Director of the Dole Institute of Politics.
Good evening, and thank you, Zach, very much. I will say welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and certainly to this evening's program with David Boaz from the Cato Institute. Before I get into his introduction, I would like to call your attention to the back of your program for our upcoming events. We are entering KU Civic Engagement and Leadership October the 20th through October 31st, and we spend time trying to make sure that our students are engaged in different activities, but especially to be actively involved in leadership. We highlight Student Senate and a lot of the other programs that we have available on our campus. Also, I think you all know that the National Make a Difference Day is October the 26th. I think you've seen lots of publicity on that, and all throughout the United States, they're trying to do different programs to make a difference in the lives of Americans. We also have the Dole Institute 10th Anniversary Series, Disabilities, the Evolution of Equality, and that's on October the 22nd at 7:30. And this is actually a program I would say is probably near and dear to many people's hearts because it has a lot to do with the work of Senator Bob Dole and his tireless effort on disabilities. So we have the Executive Director of the U.S. International Council on Disabilities, David Morrissey, will be here, and he will address the pivotal policy changes, the ever-changing face of disability challenges in America. And we know Senator Dole worked hard on this. He also did a lot to get the Senate to pass the recent United Nations Treaty on the Rights of Persons with Disability. And I think when we look at that, we think of Senator Dole, and I just want to just say this evening. If you would look at his life and over 35 years of service to the nation, not just Kansas, whether we're talking about Social Security, whether we're talking about women, infant and children, whether we're talking about SNAP, which most of us know as food stamps, and also on the policies around disabilities, Senator Dole was front and center on those issues with additional people helping in so many different ways. I also would like to call your attention again, it's our 10th anniversary, and I think you all know it's the 90th. This year, Senator Dole celebrated his 90th birthday. But we have the Dole Leadership Prize on Sunday, October the 24th at 4 p.m. And if many of you have not heard, we will be giving that award to President Nelson Mandela, and his great-grandson will be accepting in his honor. And also we have the Journalism and Politics Lecture, the work of Richard Ben Kramer, on October the 30th. We have lots of programs. We hope you will find the time to come, and we know I always remind myself of airlines. We're all competing for your business, but we're tried and true, so I hope you will stay with us in so many ways. Now for our program this evening, David Boaz from the Cato Institute. He is an Executive Vice Chancellor of the Cato Institute and has played a key role in the development of the Cato Institute and the libertarian movement. He is a provocative commentator and a leading authority on domestic issues such as education choice, drug legalization, the growth of government, and the rise of libertarians. You should also know that he and Bill Lacey are very good friends, both having attended and graduated from Vanderbilt. And Bill let me know that David was a year ahead of him. So I would also-
In more ways than one, Barbara.
That's not what I say. But I do want to share something, and I'll go on with his introduction from our dinner this evening. And, you know, when we have an opportunity, you learn something else that's new. Libertarians, in a direct quote in a roundabout way, they're not red, and they're not blue. And in many ways, journalists and the media pays very little attention. So I think David will tell you more about our conversation later on this evening in terms of, are they Republican, are they Democrat? No, he says not red or not blue. They have their own beliefs and what they should be doing. And I find that really kind of fascinating, especially when we're in a two-party system. And is there room for a third party? What role does independence play? And we talk about democracy and is it open or not. So I think you're in for a really good time. I remember when he was here before, and he also made the comment to Bill, but I was here when you weren't here. You were off in Washington doing something else. And you may ask him in one of your questions what he's referring to, but I think you all know it was the time that Bill was doing what he tells our students to do, be involved actively in what's going on in the country. I will also tell you that David Boaz is the author of Libertarianism, a primer described by Los Angeles Times, a well-researched manifesto of libertarian ideas, the editor of the Libertarian Reader and co-editor of the Cato Handbook for Policymakers. He is a frequent guest on national television and radio shows and has appeared on ABC's Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher, CNN's Crossfire, NPR's Talk of the Nation and All Things Considered, John McLaughlin's One-on-One, Fox News Channel, BBC, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other media. And his latest book is The Politics of Freedom. And you can see on the bottom, they'll tell you a little bit more about the Cato Institute. This event is co-sponsored by the Young Americans for Liberty. Whenever we can, we try to co-sponsor with different organizations or different departments on our campus. I hope you will get your questions ready. And as always, our programs are informative, educational, and as you say, whether you agree or disagree, it is an educational process that we learn, and we do that through sharing our programs with you. With that, I will ask for a warm welcome for Mr. Boaz, and I'll turn this program over to Bill Lacey this evening. And remember how you ask your questions, because I see some people back there ready. Just listen first, and you get to ask. Bill?
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to echo something Barbara said. There's lots of competition on campus all the time, but there's a lot tonight. And I really appreciate the special effort that many of you made to get out here tonight. Also very excited to see a bunch of young people here. They always tend to sit in the back. I don't know why you guys always want to sit back there, but you're very welcome, and I would encourage you to ask questions when we get to our Q&A later. Like Barbara said, Dave and I go a long way back, so we're going to try to avoid any of those stories, but I did want you to start, David, by talking a little bit about your education and how you became a libertarian.
Okay. Well, Bill and I both went to Vanderbilt in Nashville. I grew up in Western Kentucky, which made Vanderbilt the closest good college to go to. My father was politically active, and I would call him a conservative Jeffersonian Democrat. So I grew up hearing about politics and political ideas and politicians. When I was in high school, I joined the Young Democrats because that's all there was in Western Kentucky at the time. And then when I got to college, I guess I joined the College Republicans and also Young Americans for Freedom, the conservative group. But by then I was already doing some reading and coming to think, I'm a conservative, but I'm more radical on a lot of things than a lot of conservatives are. And then I did a little more reading and decided what I really am is a libertarian. And although I managed to stay in the Republican Party for a few years beyond that, and then took a brief flyer on the Libertarian Party, about 30 years ago, I gave up on partisan activities and joined the Cato Institute and hopefully played a role in making it one of the most prominent libertarian organizations around. And the good news at Cato is we stay out of politics. We do policy, and occasionally we do a little political philosophy, but we stay out of politics, and so don't ask me who I'm voting for or which candidate I hope wins. I don't have answers to those questions.
Okay. What's a good description of what the libertarian philosophy is? What do libertarians believe?
I wrote an article recently for one of our newsletters called 10 Ways to Talk About Libertarianism. I won't give you all of them. When I wrote Libertarianism a primer, I went on a lot of radio and TV shows, and that would usually be the first question: what's libertarianism? And the answer I used there was libertarianism is the idea that adult individuals have the right and the responsibility to make the important decisions about their own lives. And each word in that is important. It's about individuals, not the collective. It's about adults. Rules might be different for children. It's about individual people having the right to make their own decisions. But it's also about having the responsibility to make your own decisions. You shouldn't give away to the government or to any other body the power to decide for you what religion you'll believe in, what school your children will attend, what retirement program you'll save your money in, what kind of car you should drive, what kind of coffee you should drink. All of those things, big and small, are decisions that ought to rest with the individual. So that's my basic definition.
Mm-hmm. And what would a libertarian believe that the proper role of government is?
Different libertarians might have slightly different answers to that, but my view would be the role of government is to protect our rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think what that means is that we need a government that provides a police force to ensure that the small number of people who commit criminal acts in our society are prevented or apprehended or punished. We need a court system because we will have disputes among one another, and we need a way to settle those disputes. A lot of disputes are settled in private courts called arbitration agencies, but we probably need a government court system for some of them. We need national defense to protect us from wrongdoers overseas. And beyond that, I pretty much think the free market and the free society can handle all the other problems that arise in our lives.
So let's talk about some specific issues and get you to comment on it. First of all, I know somebody's going to ask it, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it for them. What about the social safety net?
Well, the social safety net can be looked at as a great triumph of government policy, that we now have this something like 60% of the federal budget, so it's about $2 trillion a year of money that is taken by some people and given to others, ideally, presumably, taken from you during one part of your life and given to you during another part, so at least theoretically, you have earned what you eventually get. What I would say is that the greatest anti-poverty system in the history of the world is the free market economy. The reason we can afford to have social safety nets is because we've had a market economy. If we had more of a market economy and we could grow faster than 2% a year, then we'd have even less need for a government safety net. You said safety net, and I sort of switched to talking about entitlements, but the fact is programs like Social Security and Medicare are not really a social safety net, because in theory they are money that we put in throughout our working lives and then is doled out to us at the end by the government. And that raises the question, is government the best agency to manage that money for us over the course of 40 years or so? And I would say it's not a very good manager of money. Now, I know you're all going to say that you've just watched government handle money management and you couldn't be prouder. But I would argue that politicians don't do a good job of managing your money. And one of the points to think about is, for your entire working life, you've been paying about 12% of your income every year to the Social Security system, another 3% to Medicare. If you had put 12% of your income into stocks and bonds, starting however many years ago it was for you, but 40 years over the course of a working life, do you think you'd be living better than Social Security is offering you? I think you would. I think if you look at the numbers, you would have been so much better off putting that money into securities, whatever plan you're comfortable with, than you are with government, and people would be living better lives at the end of their lives, and you'd have actual money that you own and you could leave to your children. So if you want to do something about the cycle of poverty, let working class people save enough money that they have money to leave to their children at the end of their lives. I think that would do a great deal. As for the real safety net, the idea of protecting people who have somehow not succeeded in the marketplace, there I just believe that family, friends, church, and charity are more effective than the government safety net, and that if we had a stronger economy, which we would if we had lower taxes and less government spending, and we had less money taken out of our pockets through taxes, then we would have even more charity than we have already in America. I think we'd be able to do a better job than the government does.
What do libertarians believe about economic regulation?
Well, in general, I said I believe in a government that prevents you from rape, robbery, and murder, protects your life, liberty, and property, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, protects you from overseas threats. So in general, regulations that tell people how they can use their property, what kind of trades they can engage in, whether they can accept a job at a certain wage, whether they can build a factory on a piece of property they own. I think those are generally a violation of people's individual rights, and I think they're bad for economic growth. I think we would be more prosperous if we had fewer of those regulations.
What would libertarians do about environmental issues?
Well, environmental issues I think are tough, and I think libertarians have not thought enough about those things. There is clearly a public goods aspect to the environment. In general, people are the best judges of the way they should live their own lives. Give me advice on what I should eat and drink and smoke and how much I should exercise and so on, but I don't need the government telling me what to do. I'm happy just to have advice, get information about that. And I also think we use the term public goods or public health and things like that too much. In particular, I would say, for instance, just because a lot of people have a particular health problem, like maybe obesity, does not make it a public health issue. Public health originally meant things that you and I can't easily protect ourselves from individually, like diseases that are being carried in the water or the air. And so we came up with, we need sanitation. Whether we need government to do sanitation is a different question, but we want to be able to get sanitary water into our homes to protect us from the kinds of diseases, cholera, things like that, that are carried by the water. So a lot of people say public health because that'll make it a government issue. They say public goods because that makes it a government issue. The environment involving air and water that no one person owns and controls actually is significantly a public good, and that makes it a more difficult problem. What I generally would say is I think property rights work better than collectivization and centralization. I think market solutions work better than command and control. I think that when the government steps in with one particular regulation, it makes it difficult for us to innovate and find better solutions. But that's not a fully worked out position, and I think it's something that libertarians need to continue to study because people care a lot about environmental amenities. Clearly, the reason our environment gets cleaned up is because we're richer than we used to be. We can afford, whether it's through private mechanisms or government mechanisms, to clean up the air. You can't imagine how bad the air and even the streets were back when we had horse-drawn carriages. Automobiles are much less offensive than horse-drawn carriages were in large numbers. So it's the wealth that allows us to have these choices about whether to use government or private mechanisms. Libertarians would like to rely more on private property and market mechanisms and less on centralized government control.
Okay. What about the war on drugs?
I made a distinction earlier about adults and children. And I think it's reasonable, at least plausible, to think about having laws about what kind of drugs children can use. I think we can go too far in that direction. I think if parents think that it's a good idea to introduce their children to how to drink wine when they're 15, I don't think that's an unreasonable thing for parents to do, and yet we have laws that make that illegal. But let's set children aside and let's talk about adults. I do think it is a fundamental personal freedom that you should be able to decide as an adult what you put in your body, whether that's tobacco or marijuana or sugar or cocaine or coffee. Mormons don't believe in caffeine. That's their privilege. I wouldn't want to live in a society where Mormons were able to impose that as a point of law, but it may very well be a healthy habit for them to engage in. So just as a matter of freedom, I'm opposed to the government telling adults what they can do with their bodies. But also, there's a much more practical consequence. A huge percentage of the crime in America is caused by the war on drugs, not by drugs. It is not that people get hopped up on marijuana and go out and commit murder. More likely, they get hopped up on marijuana and don't go out at all. But they sure don't become raving criminals because they're using most of the illegal drugs. What does happen, though, is that the war on drugs drives up the price of drugs, which means that it becomes more profitable to sell them, but decent people like you folks don't want to be selling illegal drugs. So who does sell illegal drugs? Outlaws, bad people, people who have, as the economists say, a comparative advantage in violence. You may think you're pretty good at picking a location for your business and deciding what to buy and what to sell. You probably do not think you would be very good at protecting that street corner with a gun if that's what was necessary. But those are the people who are drawn into the drug trade, and that means it becomes a trade carried out by criminals, just as alcohol was in the 1920s, and it means we're arresting 1 million people a year for the use of marijuana. We have 2 million people in jail in America. We have a higher percentage of our population in jail than any but 1 or 2 other countries in the world. We have more people in jail than any other country. And a lot of that is driven by the war on drugs. And one of the things it does, because there's a disproportionate arrest record for young black men, is that we're driving a whole lot of young black men out of the legitimate job market because they get a criminal record very early in their lives. That's a bad thing for them. It's a bad thing for society. The crime itself is bad for society and particularly bad for our inner cities. It causes law-abiding people who can afford to flee the inner cities instead of staying near their jobs, which you'd think they might like. But the crime rates cause people to leave. So all of those aspects say to me, economists are right when they say you will get more bad results when you try to prohibit things, as we did with alcohol, than you will get good results. So even if you don't believe in the basic libertarian argument that adults ought to be able to make their own decisions, you still should think the war on drugs has been a failure.
From a financial point of view and from just the
Well,
results.
from crime and
Yeah.
economics and the impact on society, yeah.
Okay, what about choice in education?
I think that people ought to be able to choose the schools their kids go to. Ideally, I don't think that they ought to expect the taxpayers to pay for it. One of the costs of having children is that you should pay for their food. You should also pay for their clothing. You should pay for their education. So I don't see any reason that we ought to have government schools instead of letting the market take care of education like it takes care of all the other things in our lives. Right now, we do have government schools. It's a massive system. It's not going to be overturned anytime soon. So the next best thing to me would be to say, we've collected tax money that we're planning to use to educate your kids, and you can send them to the local government school if you want to, but if you'd like to take the money that we're collecting and go pick a different school for your child, religious school, non-religious school, accelerated school if your kid's a fast learner, more basic education if your kid's not a fast learner, lots of different things, lots of different ways that you might want your children educated. I think you should have the choice to be able to do that through some kind of tax credit or scholarship program so that you're not just told, we took your money and we're giving you this one option. One of the things that I think we should notice is that we have had total communications revolution in our society, except in 2 areas, the post office still has postal carriers who pick up mail from boxes and carry it to your house. Except, in my experience, they don't carry it to your house anymore. They carry it to a place near your house. But it's still the same old thing. But nobody sends letters through the mail anymore because email just bypassed it. And schools. Schools look the same as they did when we were kids. They look the same as they did when my mother was a kid. How much difference do you think there might be in education after, let's say, the past 75 years? If we had had a market in education, do you think we might have online learning that was better than anything that's currently being done in the schools? I think probably so. But one of the things about the market is that you don't know what's going to happen. We didn't know we needed personal computers. And the first time personal computers were suggested, somebody, I think it was at IBM, famously said there's a market for about 1 million personal computers in America. Well, that's why IBM is not as big a company as it used to be. And there are a lot of new companies that came along. We don't know what kind of innovation entrepreneurs and customers might come up with in education. But the idea that it should take 12 or 13 or 14 years for people to learn to read and do arithmetic at a 12th grade level, I think is probably crazy. We could do much better than that. And I can't tell you how, because the market isn't predictable. If it were predictable, we wouldn't need a market. We'd just go ahead and do it. But we need a market to find out about personal phones and Google and personal computers and iPads and smartphones, all those kinds of things. Your smartphone, the one you turned off a minute ago, has more computing power than the computers that took Apollo spaceships to the moon. Now compare the change in that smartphone to the change in your child's school. That's what I'd like to see. What could technology and markets do for education? I don't want to say do for schools, do for education, because maybe we don't need schools at all. We do need education.
Okay. What's the proper role of government in marriage and defining marriage?
Well, that's an interesting question, and libertarians don't all agree on that. I wrote an article about 15 years ago saying privatize marriage. Why do you need the government to tell you whether you're married? You draw up a contract with the person you want to marry. You celebrate that marriage in front of your friends or in front of your church, if that's what marriage means to you. But why do you need the government to give you a license to marry the person you love? And in some sense, of course, you don't. You can start living with people. That used to not be the case. I live in Virginia, where it was illegal to cohabit until about 25 years ago. I think a few people were breaking the law, but it was illegal. So my inclination is to say we don't need government marriage laws at all. You probably want to sign a contract. It may clarify what each of you is bringing to the marriage, what each of you expects, and what might happen in the event of a breakup. And there might be various kinds of marriage contracts that you could buy at Walmart. You know, you get some book, Marriage for Dummies. And it says, well, here's this one that totally protects women. If the man wants to leave, woman gets everything. And that's one possible marriage contract. Here's another one that assumes both the man and the woman, or let's just say both the two partners, are both going to work and both be responsible for their own income. Okay, you might want a different kind of contract there. If you're planning to have children, maybe you want to write the contract slightly differently. I do have a couple of colleagues at the Cato Institute who have arguably looked into this more closely than I have, and they say, no, the basic traditional common law of marriage is a better protection for the independence and autonomy and freedom of the family than this non-governmental system that you're talking about. So there's at least a debate there. What I would say is if there's government marriage, then equal protection under the Constitution ought to apply. And that's why in 1967 the Supreme Court said that, again, my state of Virginia could not ban interracial marriage. And I think probably someday soon the Supreme Court is going to say states cannot forbid two people of the same sex to get married under the same grounds that they used to strike down the Virginia interracial marriage law, that it isn't the government's business to tell two adults whether they can get married or not, so long as they're, let's say so long as they're not close blood relatives. That's a different issue. But as long as they don't fall into that category, then the government shouldn't tell people who they can marry.
Okay. Art Hall, and I don't know, Art, if you're still around or not, but yeah, from the business school, asked a great question, at dinner tonight, and I just thought your answer was so interesting that I wanted to borrow your question but credit it. Are we going the way of Rome? Is freedom ever going to make a comeback?
A lot of libertarians and even more conservatives, I think, do think of the world that way. They think we are going the way of Rome, bread and circuses ending in tyranny. They think in particular that the book, The Road to Serfdom, is not only a brilliant book, but it is our window on the world. That's what's been happening in America since Roosevelt, maybe since Woodrow Wilson. We have been on the road to serfdom. I have a more optimistic view. I agree with Adam Smith, who told somebody, young man, there is a deal of ruin in a nation. Nations are pretty resilient. You can do a lot to them if you leave the basics in place. Adam Smith also had a great line about all that is necessary to go from barbarism to opulence is peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice. You'll notice he didn't say no taxes. He wasn't as radical as some libertarians. And he didn't say perfect justice. He said a tolerable administration of justice. So if you have those things, you can generally survive. When I was in college, the first libertarian speaker I ever saw told us that we were going to have hyperinflation. This was the 1970s, so it seemed plausible. We were going to have hyperinflation and we had better buy gold and guns. Well, as it turned out, our political system was not that dysfunctional, and we didn't get hyperinflation. We got high inflation. It was bad, but it wasn't hyperinflation. It wasn't Weimar Germany. These days, I think a lot of conservatives and libertarians think, oh my God, if Obamacare actually gets implemented, that's just the end. We'll never have freedom in America again. And I think they miss a lot of what has happened in America over the past generation or two. They see a lot of the growth in government, the entitlement state, the $3.6 trillion federal budget, the environmental regulations, the niggling nanny state regulations. What they forget about is, when I was in college, one of the things I was most worried about was being drafted and sent to Vietnam. Young people today don't worry about that. That's a huge increase in freedom. When I was young, we still had regulations left over from the New Deal that micromanaged finance, transportation, telecommunications. You couldn't start flying an airplane from Kansas City to Chicago without getting the permission of the Civil Aeronautics Board in Washington, which they usually wouldn't give you because they would say, oh no, there's an airline already flying between Kansas City and Chicago. Sure, the rates are high and they only fly once a day, but we don't see the need for another one. And we checked with the industry, and the industry agrees there's no need for a new entrant. That's literally the way it worked. So we got rid of all those regulations in the late 70s. We also dramatically cut tax rates in the early 1980s, and that was a significant increase in freedom. And another thing that I think conservatives in particular really don't credit as an advance for freedom, and libertarians agree with it when I point it out to them, but they don't think about it a lot of times. And that is how many people were excluded from basic American freedoms a couple of generations ago. Black people, almost entirely excluded from basic American freedoms. Gay people, and women, not excluded legally in the same way that black people were, but through both laws and social customs, largely excluded from social and economic life and also political life, but I'd rather focus on the social and economic mainstream of the country. Now that all those groups have been brought into the circle of freedom, we have extended the promises of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to all those people. That's a huge increase in freedom. Now, we can weigh that against some declines in freedom. We can even say possibly, well, maybe for straight white men there's less freedom, but for everybody else there's somewhat more, and here's a balance there. I think it's not a simple question, but my basic answer to are we going the way of Rome is no. We're still a dynamic society, a dynamic economy. We have a lot of art, we have a lot of economic enterprise, we have a lot of innovative technology, and we need to keep fighting for freedom. because we ought to be growing at faster than 2% a year, and we still have more restrictions on people's lives that we ought to get rid of, but I do not believe we're going the way of Rome, and I don't believe that we are in fact on the road to serfdom.
Most people, Dave, look at politics as the political spectrum as a linear right-left design, but that doesn't really work with libertarianism, does it?
Libertarians hate that linear spectrum. Not exactly clear what left and right mean. I can remember way back when I was studying political science thinking this doesn't quite make sense. Why should it be the case that if you believe in lower taxes, you are also supposed to believe in the war on drugs? Maybe some people do believe both those things, but what exactly is the connection? And similarly, if you believe that government should take care of people, but you don't support the war on drugs, well, don't you want to take care of people? Drugs can be dangerous. You should take care of people. Now, in fact, as it turns out, I discovered most liberals do believe in the war on drugs, so they weren't being inconsistent on that particular point. If you think of two axes of things government might do, interfere in your personal life, interfere in your economic life, then you don't get a straight line, you get sort of a square matrix. You might believe the government should stay out of both your personal and economic life, and then you'd be a libertarian. You might believe the government should get heavily involved in your economic life, but stay out of your personal life, and maybe that makes you a liberal. A conservative might think, keep the government out of my pocketbook, keep it out of the economy, but we need government to protect morality and decency and all of that. So that's maybe a conservative position. And if you support government getting involved in both your personal life and your economic life, political scientists usually call that populist. I think that's a little unfair to the populists. Authoritarian or statist might be a better term for that. But yeah, instead of a horizontal spectrum, I look at it something like a diamond. Liberty is up here, and communism is down here, and then there's the left and the right off to the sides.
I know you spend a lot of time analyzing the electorate. Is there a politically viable libertarian coalition out there? Is there a way that you could ever elect a libertarian to, like, say, president?
Well, there's not likely to be a consistent intellectual conservative or liberal elected president. To get 51% of the country behind you, you have to make a lot of compromises. You have to appeal to a lot of interest groups and so on. So is there going to be a pure libertarian intellectual elected president? No. You can argue that several of our recent presidents have understood, one of the things that we talk about sometimes in looking at libertarianism in the real political world is two things happened relatively early in my lifetime. The 60s happened, a cultural revolution, a women's rights revolution, sexual revolution, all of that. And so in large measure, an individualist libertarian revolution. And then the 80s happened, the Reagan revolution, the entrepreneurial revolution, the tax cut revolution, and again, kind of a libertarian individualist revolution. Both of these things happened in one generation, and yet a lot of people thought, well, the 60s were leftist and the 80s were rightist. Libertarians can look at it and say, well, they both kind of moved us in a libertarian direction. And I used to write things saying, the first party to recognize that the 60s and the 80s both happened will be the one that dominates American politics. Well, as it turned out, Bill Clinton was a guy who clearly came out of the 60s, but also didn't have any intention of reversing the Reagan Revolution. He was clear about that. He wanted to clean up welfare as we know it, and he wasn't talking about raising taxes or anything. And then you got George W. Bush, who, when he ran for president, talked about freedom, did not talk about social issues or imposing his own moral values on people, and also obviously talked about continuing the Reagan Revolution. So I think you can argue that Clinton and Bush both campaigned in a mildly libertarian direction. Now, I think it's harder to make that case for Obama, although you could stretch a point and find that. So I don't think a libertarian intellectual, consistent guy is going to be elected president. Could a libertarian be elected governor or senator? Sure, and a couple of them have been. could a dynamic, pro-economic innovation, tax-cutting, socially tolerant person be elected president? Absolutely. His biggest challenge would be getting the nomination of either one of the parties, because you've got a lot of unions and other interest groups in the Democratic Party who wouldn't like that candidacy, and you've got a lot of social conservatives who wouldn't like that candidacy in the Republican Party. But if such a person could get a nomination, I think he might very well win.
Okay. I've got two more questions, then we're going to open it up to your questions. What's Cato's mission, and what's your role at Cato?
Okay. The Cato Institute, first I should say, despite our beautiful logo designed by the greatest graphic designer of our epoch, is not an acronym. Cato is named for Cato's Letters, which were a series of newspaper essays in the 18th century that challenged the big government and the incipient tyranny of the time. And what those authors did was take the ideas of great intellectuals like John Locke and apply them to contemporary issues. So that's how we got our name, because that's what we were going to do when we were started. We're going to take the ideas of great thinkers like John Locke and Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and apply them to contemporary policy issues. So in one sense, that's our mission. I believe our formal mission statement is the Cato Institute will use the most effective means possible to develop, disseminate, and advocate policy proposals consistent with the traditional American values of individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and peace. So that's our mission. We do that through publishing books and studies, doing research, providing the results of the research, and increasingly, as the world gets more fragmented and more participatory in a lot of ways, we also do it through blogging and internet interviews and op-eds in the newspapers and op-eds online now and all those kinds of things. My title is Executive Vice President. I've been there for about 30 years. Cato's 35 years old. I have worked over that time with the founder and CEO, who recently stepped down, to develop our program, to hire scholars, to hire communicators, to hire eventually the web technicians who make it possible for us to communicate. But my principal role is overseeing the public policy research at Cato. So we have economists and foreign policy specialists and specialists in civil liberties and so on, and I oversee that process.
Okay, one last question, then like I say, we'll open it up to your questions. If we have a lot of young people here tonight, a number of young people, but also maybe adults who want to know more about libertarianism, and what would you direct them to read? What would be the most compelling and valuable thing that they could read?
Well, I certainly can't argue with Libertarianism, a Primer. Personally, I think it's an excellent book. There is a website, libertarianism.org, created by the Cato Institute, and on there you will find a 2-minute video about libertarianism and a 20-minute video about libertarianism, and then a bunch of recommended books and essays and so on. So those are all good places to start.
Okay, let's open it up to questions. We have Jen and Quinn, and they'll circulate around and grab you guys. And I'm sure we've gored a lot of sacred oxes here tonight, so don't hesitate to ask some questions.
Am I up first? Thank you for coming. We appreciate welcome. Sorry. Welcome to Lawrence.
Thank you.
And I saw on Facebook today you were joined on Ward Parkway today, so in
Yes,
Kansas
indeed.
City. That's good. One of the things that's interesting to me is the school choice, which is you have a portfolio, I assume, at the Cato that people are doing a lot of research in that area. Would you speak to, there's all different kinds of ways of tax credits and scholarships and things like that. The one that I'm the most interested in, and if you all have done any research on it and care to speak to it, is the education savings accounts like they're doing in the state of Arizona. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm familiar. Can you describe what education savings accounts are?
Yes. What they're doing is, state of Arizona, they're taking about 90% of the state funding, okay, and they're putting that into an account for each child. Now, right now, they're just doing it for special needs and a few others, but they're expanding it every year. But it's very effective, and they have 12 different areas that the parents can choose to put the money. It can be in a traditional school, a religious school,
Right.
online learning, tutoring, I mean, all different kinds of ways. There's 12 of them by law, and it's proving very effective, like a 94, 95% approval by the parents.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of innovations like that going on in different states. I think that puts the right focus on the child. The focus shouldn't be on we have the schools and we operate them in the interests of the administrators or the teachers or whatever. The focus should be on we've agreed collectively to collect this money and we're going to spend it to educate our children. So that's putting the focus on the individual child. What I do worry about is if parents take that money and they go spend it at a private school, that is going to encourage a lot of people to say, now that private school is getting government money, and we can regulate it the way we regulate the public schools. And if they do that, they will destroy the independence and the innovation of the private schools. We can try to write into law that this money, once it gets into the savings account of the parent, is no longer government money, it's the parent's money, and therefore this is not government money going to schools. But you can write that into law and the legislature can write a new law. So that's what worries me. That's why I tend to think a more promising option is tax credits where the money never goes to the government. You want to send your child to the local government school, you just pay your education tax and you go down and register at the local school. But if you want to send your child to a different school or spend money on homeschooling expenditures, then you spend that money and you take a credit against your income tax or your property tax, and therefore the money's never gone through the government's coffers. It's not government money, it's your money, and that provides a greater degree of separation between the parent, the family, and the government, and therefore a greater degree of separation between the government and the school. So opening up more options, charter schools, homeschooling, scholarship programs, the education savings account, I think those are good things. I worry about money going directly from government to private schools. I worry that instead of creating more private schools, more alternative schools, we'll end up creating more government schools than we have now.
Okay, next question. Got one back here. We've got a gentleman up front, Jen, you want to take care of right on the corner here? Go ahead, Quinn.
All right. At the beginning, you referenced the libertarian view on the executive branch and the judicial branch. What is the libertarian view of what the legislative branch should be doing?
You say the executive branch?
Yeah, what the legislative branch should be doing.
Oh, what the legislative branch
Yeah,
should be doing.
yeah.
Well, the legislative branch is there to make laws. The only problem is they make too many of them, and they have been supine in the face, at least I can't speak as an expert on state governments. At the federal level, I believe that Congress has been far too acquiescent in the accumulation of executive power by the president. We talk about the imperial presidency, and that's true. Presidents, understandably, have an institutional instinct to aggregate more power to the presidency and the executive branch. But Congress is supposed to have, this was the notion of the Constitution, each branch will be jealous of its prerogatives. Congress is supposed to resist executive authority. But a lot of times, I think what goes on is that Congress doesn't like making decisions. People run for Congress in order to make the laws of the nation and make important decisions like should we go to war and how do we balance our budget. And then they discover that you make people mad when you make decisions. So it's easier just to let the president make the decision. You will notice Congress never declares war anymore. They either turn their head and look the other way while the president goes to war, or they pass an authorization for the use of military force. I believe that's what we did in Iraq. So they didn't say, Iraq, we are declaring war on you. They just said, President Bush, if you think we need to do something about Iraq, you go ahead and do it. I think that's irresponsible. I think it's an abdication of responsibility. And if you don't want to make decisions like whether the United States goes to war, then you shouldn't run for Congress. So I blame presidents for trying to arrogate power to themselves and for encouraging Congress to pass laws that say things like, there shall be clean air, we leave it to the EPA to decide how, and then just let these executive branch agencies legislate. Making law is the prerogative of the legislature. Early presidents understood this. Early presidents believed that they had been appointed to operate the government that would be created by the legislature. And they typically did not veto bills on policy grounds. They would veto them if they thought they were unconstitutional. But if they simply thought it was bad policy, they didn't think that was the business of the executive branch. The executive branch is there to execute. He's a hired manager. But over the years, my colleague Gene Healy wrote a good book on this called The Cult of the Presidency. Over the years, the president became more visible, more powerful. He's one guy, so he's got unity there. The Congress can be split a lot of times. The legislative branch should make laws. It should make fewer of them, but in particular, it should make presidents make fewer laws.
Okay, we have our next question here.
Thank you for coming. I noticed that you mentioned in many ways the Cato Institute spends money on people, personnel, for instance. I'm wondering what the source of that money is other than your publications.
Well, the source is donors. We don't take any government money, and we don't sell very many publications. That's a small part of what we get. We have about 16,000 donors who give us a total of about $20 million a year. So obviously they vary. Some give $50, some give $500,000. But it's a total of 16,000 people who give us money, and mostly we get them by using direct mail. We send out letters to people who subscribe to libertarian magazines or whatever, and some small percentage of them send a check in.
Okay. Got a question back here. You actually have a couple questions.
What is your opinion on the Citizens United Supreme Court case, and do you believe that corporations are people?
Corporations are legally people. They're not exactly people, but I think everybody should be free to express their opinion about politicians, and the more negative, the better. So I absolutely believe that a group of people ought to be able to get together and produce a video on what a terrible president Hillary Clinton would be, and then spend money putting it on TV. And that's exactly what the Citizens United was. This was not a corporation like IBM. This was a group of people who gave money to a nonprofit organization, but legally a corporation, in order to make a video denouncing Hillary Clinton. And obviously, there are plenty of groups on the left that make videos denouncing right-wingers, and that's fine too. So in general, I am in favor of deregulating electoral freedom. I'm in favor of deregulating campaign spending. I think it's fine to have disclosure of where money comes from, although even there have been many cases in American history of where disclosure creates a chilling effect on people. The NAACP won a legal case once, getting the permission not to reveal their donors because people in the South in the 1950s did not want to be identified as donors to the NAACP. The Socialist Workers' Party won such a case. They said people won't give money to the Socialist Workers' Party if their names are going to be publicly reported. In 1978, there was an anti-gay initiative in California, and there was a group organized to oppose it. And at the time, you had to report any donor who gave you more than $50. And the Los Angeles Times quoted the organizer of the group fighting the anti-gay initiative, that is the pro-gay side, who said, we get an awful lot of donations of $49. People in California in 1978 didn't want to be identified as supporting the gay side. Some of my friends worked hard in the term limits movement, and they had plenty of businessmen say to them, listen, I think term limits would be a great idea, but I can't be seen with my name on a term limits list. Do you know what my senator or my governor would do if he thought I was trying to turn him out of office? So it's easy to say, let's just have disclosure, but we ought to at least weigh the chilling effect on free speech when we talk about required disclosure. And by the way, that's become a more fraught issue now with the internet. Because it used to be, even in the days of the term limits battle in the 90s, you'd have to go down to the Secretary of State's office to find out who gave money to the term limits campaign. Now, if you're the governor's campaign manager, that's not a difficult thing for you to do. But now, contributions are posted on the internet. And there was, in the California Proposition 8 case, there were people, remember I said in 1978, people didn't want to be on the pro-gay list. In 2008, people discovered that having their name on the anti-gay contributions list turned out to be bad for business, bad for their social life. People began to criticize them and snub them and boycott their businesses. I think all of that chilling effect is a chilling effect on democracy, and it's the reason we have a secret ballot, right? I mean, why not stand up in the town square and say, I'm voting for Brownback, I'm voting against Brownback? Well, the reason we don't do that is we worry that people wouldn't feel free to vote the way they believe. That's why we have a secret ballot. I think the same things apply, although I do see competing values there between transparency and the chilling effect on free speech. Sometimes we have to balance things.
Okay. Quinn, you had another, and you also have a question right there to your right. Okay. Do you have somebody, Jen? Okay, we're going to take our time, so just be patient with us here. We have plenty of time.
I don't necessarily want to talk about like a school choice per se, but something that seemed like your ideal world would be a privatization of the education market. Right now we're seeing a whole bunch of other countries achieving more by investing more in education. Why would it be better if we were to subject our education to the market, the booms and busts of the business cycle? Why would that be good for our education?
Well, in fact, what we have seen is that the closer you get to an education market, the better the results are. My colleague Andrew Coulson wrote a book called Market Education, The Unknown History, and it is an unknown history. People don't realize how many instances in history there have been of totally free market education, which has in fact worked better. What we have in the United States today is a system of government and politicized domination of the schools. One of the differences with some school systems in other countries is they're government run, but they're not democratically run. You do not organize a campaign in France to get women's studies into the schools or gay studies or anything like that. The Minister of Education decides and he imposes one rule. We would find that unduly authoritarian. We let political forces decide, and that's one of the problems. I just think, we used to say in America, we have the best telephone system in the world. And that was true. We had a monopoly capitalist system. Every other country in the world had a government-run telephone system, and ours was better than any of theirs. But when we deregulated our telephone system and got some competition in there, we started getting some innovation. 25 years ago, the biggest innovation in telephones was the Princess phone. It was pink. That was like a huge innovation. As soon as we deregulated, we started getting fax machines and call waiting and call forwarding, and then it was just all swept away with the cell phone revolution. So that's what I want to see in education, and we will not get that. We have tripled the level of real education spending over the past 30 or 40 years, and it has not improved our results. If we triple it again, do we believe that will be the magic number? I don't believe that. I believe that the reason our cars are better than they used to be is that we have a competitive market for cars. The reason technology has increased 1 million-fold, communications technology, is because we have a market there. The reason we have cheap and plentiful food, some people would say too cheap and too plentiful, but the great battle of human history is to get enough food, not to die. And we solved that problem, and we've continued to drive down the price of food, and that is a huge victory, first in America, then in Europe, and now increasingly in the world. And that's what the power of the market can do. And when we take an area like education that's never had the market involved, we have trouble seeing how it would work. And I'm going to say again, I don't know how it would work, because that's the nature of the market. I could not have predicted the personal computer or the fax machine or the smartphone or any of that, and neither could Bill Gates. Do you know Bill Gates wrote a book about technology around 1995 that didn't mention the internet? I mean, this is Bill Gates, and he didn't predict the internet 2 years out. But that's what the market does. The market is so much smarter than any individual that you get many-fold increases in quality. That's what I want to see in education. That's what I think we would see if we tried a different system. Now, maybe one way to do it is let's divide the country down the middle. All the states east of the Mississippi, they get to double education spending. All the states west of the Mississippi, they get government out of education. I'm going to bet on the states west of the Mississippi, but at least it'll be a test.
Okay, got a question right here.
Some would believe that abortion is a denial of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Therefore, others would say it's an individual right of a woman to choose. I'm just wondering, where does libertarianism come down on the subject of abortion?
You just described the two places libertarians come down. I think it's fair to say that most libertarians are pro-choice, but there certainly are a significant number who are pro-life, and they would put it pretty much the way you did. If you're a pro-choice libertarian, you say it's a woman's body, it's her right to choose. If you're a pro-life libertarian, you're going to say the purpose of government is to protect life, liberty, and property, and we start with life. I think it's kind of a unique situation. In general, libertarians believe that rights don't conflict. If you really have a right to something, then somebody else doesn't have a right to take that away from you. Abortion may be one place where rights may actually be in conflict. So anyway, I don't think there is a libertarian answer on that. I think it's a difficult question. And I will say, I believe that one of the most vicious battles in America is between pro-life and pro-choice activists. But in my experience, pro-life libertarians and pro-choice libertarians can get along together pretty well because they can each see why the other one would come to a different conclusion, even though they disagree.
Okay, I have a question back here.
Would it be worthwhile to identify cities, counties, and school districts that would serve as demonstration projects for libertarian government?
Well, if we could pick out a few of those cities and get them to agree they would do that, that would be great. But in any one of those places, you're still going to have to go through the political process. Now, there's a group of people who think that's exactly what you should do. They're called the Free State Project, and they got people to sign up on an internet list saying, once the Free State Project makes a collective decision on what state we should all move to make it libertarian, I promise to move. And eventually, I guess it was once they identify the state and we get 20,000 people to sign this promise or something like that. Well, they went ahead and they chose a state. They chose New Hampshire, which was already arguably the most libertarian state in the country. So they chose New Hampshire, and a lot of them, even though they didn't already have the 20,000, went ahead and moved there. So there are some number of people, and I don't know how many it is, probably a few hundred, who have moved to New Hampshire, identify themselves with the Free State Project. They've elected a few people to the legislature, but it's a legislature of 400 people, so a few is not that many. They've got a lot of rock-ribbed fiscal conservatives and some fleeing Massachusetts liberals who are socially liberal. So, as I say, New Hampshire is a fairly libertarian state already, and I'm not sure how much the Free State Project has tilted it. But the fact that they only got, I think, a few hundred people to move is an indication that you probably aren't going to get enough people to move to Kansas City or even Lawrence to take it over, steamroller the opposition, and start slashing taxes and government agencies and so on. You're still going to have to be involved in the politics there. And also, my response to the Free State Project was, I don't see why I should have to move to New Hampshire in order to be free. I think the federal government should move to New Hampshire and leave the other 49 states to us. I'm in favor of libertarians in whatever city or state they're in, trying to make that state a model for libertarian governance, but that requires going through the democratic process.
Okay. We have a question right up here on the front row. Did we have a question like about 3 rows back here? Did somebody have a question? No? No? Okay.
So how are we going to make freedom desirable to the American public? Because that's what you're talking about here. And they don't seem to be anxious to be free.
I don't think that's quite the right question. I don't think there are very many Americans who would say, I don't want freedom. But the fact is, we are a very free country. And I think that when libertarians rail against the fact that we're sliding into tyranny, a lot of people think we're crazy. They look around the world first, and they see a lot of other countries, and then they look around our country, and they say we have a lot of freedom. And they're right. They're not just deluded. Now, I think they have insufficient appreciation for the damage done by the war on drugs, if it doesn't affect them directly. There used to be a saying, a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged. And because crime did play a role in moving some people on the left over to the right. Irving Kristol responded, a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. That was a good line. But there are some people also who say a civil libertarian is a conservative who's been arrested. So if you've been arrested, or if your son's been arrested, then you may start to understand what's wrong with the war on drugs. But if that doesn't happen, then you don't appreciate that. And it's hard to get a lot of people to appreciate the dangers of getting hooked on government money. You would hope that Americans would be outraged at the level of taxation we have, even though marginal tax rates are lower than they were when I was a kid. Not a lot of people paid them, but there were higher rates. Nevertheless, most people are still wealthier than their parents were and a lot wealthier than their grandparents were, and so even though they're paying what we consider high taxes, they don't feel the pain of it in the way that I think they ought to. There is also the problem of tax withholding. There is no way the federal government would collect the amount of money it does if it asked you to send that much money in every April. If we did not have tax withholding, if we asked people to write a check, and what would it be for you? $6,000, $8,000, $12,000? You wouldn't get those checks. There would be a mass tax revolt. So tax withholding was a big defeat for liberty and for transparency. A lot of people believe in transparency. You want transparency? Stop giving people phony paychecks that say you earned $214 this week. No, you earned $280 this week, and $66, whatever that would be, has already been sent off to the government. But you don't even get that. If you ask your daughter, what's your paycheck? What are you paid? She'd say, I'm paid $350 a week. No, you're paid $450 a week. That's what your employer is paying for your services. So people don't know that. So you want to fix one thing? Abolish tax withholding. Even making it clear on the pay stub, you earned $500. Taxes, $107. You get $393. People would notice that in a way they don't notice the way it runs. What is FICA? Who knows what FICA is? Nobody knows what those things mean. They just know what their bottom line is. So that would be one way to do it, but the government knows that very well. And therefore, the political establishment is never going to allow us to abolish withholding, which means all we can do is keep making our case to people, keep arguing that these programs don't work and they violate our freedom, and notice that in some ways we have had a trend. We have more free speech in this country than we used to, except for the campaign spending issue. We have more freedom. We do have more sexual freedom than we used to. We have more freedom for women. We have more freedom for gay people and black people. All of those things count. But when the government tries to take a big chunk of freedom all at once, there's frequently a pushback. The election of Ronald Reagan, the '94 election of the Republicans, I think were both pushes against what the government had done in terms of taxes and spending. And I think you can say 2006 and 2008 were reactions against 8 years of war and higher taxes and a struggling economy, the kinds of things that libertarians had been criticizing. Unfortunately, you have to elect either Republicans or Democrats, and the message gets very muddled because then they come in and don't do much about it. Remember when Obama was going to end this war?
Okay. We have a question back here.
Hi there. Thanks for coming. You talked a little bit earlier about the broader mission of the Cato Institute. I was wondering, who specifically are you targeting? Who's your more specific audience? And what sorts of actions or activities are you trying to promote with the Cato Institute?
Well, we're not exactly trying to promote any action or activity. We're trying to spread good information and good ideas. Our target audience is what we call in our literature educated lay people. There are 300 million people in America. An awful lot of them are not interested in learning about the sources of economic growth or the dangers of the war on drugs or whatever. But there's some number of people who are. And you might think of them as people who watch C-SPAN and cable television networks, people who visit internet websites that talk about these kinds of things. When I started at Cato 30 years ago, we would say, anybody who reads a newspaper op-ed page. Now I think I would just say anybody who reads a newspaper. That's a small enough group of people. So those are the people we're targeting. We may specifically target members of Congress and their staff. We target journalists, of course, because they take ideas and distribute them to a larger group. But the real group of people that we're trying to reach are the people who care enough about what's going on in the country, intellectually and politically, that they are reading newspapers, watching C-SPAN, those kinds of things, and we want to be part of their understanding of what's going on.
Okay. We have time for one or two more questions, and then we got two more already identified. We'll take this one right up here.
There was already one in the back, and her question was just taken.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, then we have one. Well, we'll do a final question right here with Scotty then, but Quinn goes first.
Thanks for coming. I just wanted to say, I'm sure you've heard the statistic that says, CEO compensation comparative to the average worker's compensation has grown exponentially over the last 40 or something years or so. And I just want to know, from a libertarian perspective, what's the cause of the quote-unquote rich getting richer while a majority of Americans' pay remains stagnant?
Well, first, I don't think it's true that a majority of Americans remain stagnant. Americans have better living standards than they've had in the past. Standard of living is not growing as fast as it ought to. But if we look at the size of the average American home, which has gotten much larger, and that isn't just CEOs, it's the average American home. If we look at the televisions in those homes, the food in both variety and quality and quantity in those homes, and the smartphones, I'm always amused by people who are using their smartphone to distribute the message that people are being driven into poverty. The fact is, the average American's standard of living has risen a great deal. It is true that there has been, it is debatable, but it is probably true that there has been some increase in inequality. My view is, I don't care. As long as I'm better off, it doesn't bother me that Bill Gates is even more better off. The market went up today, and do you know what that means for inequality? It means that Bill Gates got richer today by a multiple of my annual income. So inequality increased today, but I don't mind that. I don't mind the fact that Bill Gates, on a good day, becomes worth another $1 billion. If the market goes up 2%, Bill Gates is probably worth another $1 billion. But if the market goes up 2%, I'm worth another $1,000, and that's better than not going up at all. What are the reasons for that? Well, I think one reason for it is that markets have gotten so much bigger here in the United States first, because we have more people. They have more money to spend, which means more money in the marketplace, and global markets. American companies are now selling products in Europe, in Japan, increasingly in China and India. And what that means is, if you can sell to 1% of the people in America, you make a good bit of money. If If you can sell to 1% of the people in America, India, and China, you make 10 times as much money. And that tends to raise the income of the CEOs or the largest shareholders of those companies. So a large part of it is globalization. But what it means is more people are being brought into the global marketplace. So if you're making automobiles and you sell more automobiles, then the CEO gets richer. But the more important thing is that people in India and China now have automobiles, and they didn't before. And that seems to me a good trade-off. So I'm not bothered by it. I know some people are. I would be bothered. I'm bothered by poverty, and I'm bothered by the fact that American standard of living isn't rising as much as it should be and could be. But I'm not bothered just by the fact that some people are richer than others and are richer than others by a larger margin than they used to be.
Okay, last question.
Welcome. And I am disappointed I didn't get to hear about Bill sowing his wild oats in college. But what I'm wondering, I've said, Susie is poking me. As I sat here tonight, I thought, oh, it all sounds wonderful. Sounds very utopian. And then I'm jolted to think, unfortunately, we're not perfect human beings. So what do we do about the 12% of people who think it'd be great to keep that rather than send it automatically being deducted by the government out of their check? And they don't save it. And there they are when they're 67 now. What do we do with them? What do we do with the parent that didn't want the child, maybe, couldn't care less about the child, and there's nothing that tells them they have to educate this child? What about the child?
Well, on education, I didn't say anything about compulsory educational laws. I said children are different from adults. Now, as a libertarian, I'm not keen on the idea of telling parents they have to send their children to school, especially since I'm not keen on the whole idea of school. I'm keen on education, but not necessarily school. And if you have compulsory attendance laws, then you have to define where they attend. Now, you could have alternatives. You say kids have to pass a certain test each year. Well, if we applied that rule to the current government schools, then a whole lot of parents would be punished because their kids won't pass these tests because they're being taught in lousy schools. Your larger point, I appreciate the concern. I think in general, people exercise rights and opportunities that they have better than they exercise rights that they don't have. Very few people worry that parents don't know how to buy a car. Very few people worry about the people who don't know how to buy a cell phone. You may have bought a better one than I did, and Susie may have bought a better value one than you did, but on the whole, you know, we all get pretty good phones, and we know how to buy them. We know how to buy computers and iPads and things. We know how to buy food. But we don't know how to buy education because we don't. The government has told us for our entire lives, we provide education. It's the Flint Hills School, you go there. That's the end of it. There are no choices involved. If you had grown up watching your parents choose schools, if you had then, as a young mother, chosen schools for your children wouldn't have any problem. It would be just as natural as buying a car, buying a house. So one of the problems is we let our skills atrophy when we take away the opportunity to use them. Now, how do we make that transition? Well, here's one possibility in both of the areas that you talked about. As a libertarian, I'd like to get government out of the retirement business. Let people make their own decisions and bear the consequences of those decisions. And if that means having to depend on your children or your nieces and nephews or your church when you get old because you didn't save anything, well, that will be a lesson to other people in the community. But I haven't persuaded you. So let me suggest that in both of those areas, we could move partway in a libertarian direction, and I would see much less potential downside. For Social Security, for instance, what if we said to people, we're going to mandate that you put aside 12% of your income for retirement. But you can do it either by just signing your name and staying in the Social Security system and risking whatever insolvency that may involve, or you can take that money and put it in an approved savings vehicle. That's what they've done in Chile, and about 90% of people opted out. They said, I want to put my money in a savings vehicle. And now they have passbooks, like the bank passbooks we used to carry when I was a kid. And it shows how much money they have. So there, you're still mandating that they have to save. You're just giving them more choice. And again, I predict the people who save in approved savings vehicles, which might be mutual funds that are divided in some way between stocks and bonds, so on, would end up with a lot more money at the end of their lives. And that would be, again, a lesson to their neighbors and their children and everything. That may work better. And with schools, let's just say that we're not going to get rid of the compulsory attendance laws. We're just going to let parents decide what school. We will even for the time being say it's still school. You have to send your kid to school, but you get to choose what school it is. Plus, we've already allowed, I think now in all 50 states, parents to homeschool. So they don't have to send their children to school. They have to educate them, and I think homeschoolers are tested, and they have to pass a test, which, as I say, if you're homeschooling your kid and your kid can't pass a third grade skills test at the end of third grade, then you're in trouble. But if you're sending your kid to the government school and he can't pass a third grade test, then he just gets held back in third grade, you know. No, the teacher doesn't get in trouble, the principal doesn't get in trouble, just your kid gets in trouble. So I think in both of these cases, if we kept the mandates, but we allowed people to choose how they would fulfill them, at least they'd have that much more freedom, and they'd be developing their skills at choosing schools and choosing financial vehicles. And so maybe the moderate libertarian course would be, let's try that for 25 years and see whether people at the end of that or somewhere along that way don't say, you know, I found out I do know how to choose a school for my kid. I found out I do know how to save for my own retirement. And I've saved enough, I'm not sure why I have to keep saving 12% of my income. I think if I saved 8% from here on out, I'd be good enough. And so they might lobby the government to say, well, it doesn't need to be 12%. Why don't we say once you get to $800,000 in your retirement account, we don't insist that you save anymore because you've got enough to cover your retirement. I think there could be solutions like that. And I think in a whole lot of areas, more freedom would benefit a lot of people. And in my view, even more freedom than that would benefit even more people. But for people who are hesitant to go as far as I would, we can go part of the way.
Okay. David, thanks for a great discussion tonight.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation.
And again, I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I really appreciate your support. So see you next time.